Jimmy Dore at the anti-war rally, he's anti-war, totally anti-war. But in this clip, he's going to say literally every single pro-Russian talking point, pro-invasion talking point that you can physically think of. So I'm gonna play the clip uninterrupted, then we're gonna go through it again and break it down.
Russia is the one that wants peace in this deal, and Ukraine and NATO do not. They want to bleed Russia economically, and that's why they blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I can't get why the European nations are going along with this. There was the foreign minister of Germany said, I don't care about my people if they don't want this. I care about the people of Ukraine. What leader of a country says they don't care about their own people, but they care more about somebody else's country? NATO has provoked this. In fact, there was a peace agreement in 2014. The CIA helped overthrow the Ukraine government, and then the people in the Donbass didn't want to go along with this coup government, right? Because the leader of Ukraine wanted to be friendlier economically with Russia instead of join like the European Union, and that they couldn't have that, right? So that's why they did a coup, and the people, the Russian speakers in the Donbass, didn't want to go along with that coup. They kind of wanted to break away. Ukraine government started shelling the Donbass, and so they had a peace agreement called the Minsk Agreement, and that was supposed to give them independence. They were supposed to have their own elections, and they were going to stop shelling them. They never did. They ended up killing like 14 or 15,000 people in the Donbass. Merkel, the former prime minister of Germany, just admitted that the only reason they did that peace agreement was to give Ukraine enough time to build up its military, so when they finally did provoke an invasion, which is what they did, that they would have a military ready to fight Russia. And so people don't know this is what happened. And so they just think that one day Putin woke up and said, I want to go invade Ukraine because I'm a maniac. And they think that he's the bad guy. They think that he's acting rationally. He's acting, we always knew he would do this. In fact, we were counting on him doing this. That's why we did what we did. And they don't know that Ukraine ramped up their bombing right before the war started last year. They doubled their bombing. They were really trying to provoke it, and they did. And they provoked it. And the Russian would rather have a peace agreement. The rest of the world would rather have a peace agreement. Not NATO, not Joe Biden, not the military-industrial complex. And so that's where we are.
Okay, so he said every single pro-Russia, pro-invasion talking point you could possibly do. There's no credit given to the Ukrainian people. There's no credit given to the idea of like, hey man, you know, here's some reasons why I don't think Putin should have invaded, or like any of that. Just talking point. So I have to go through this because there was so much gunk there. He smeared so much feces on the wall that it'd be very difficult for anybody to clean it up while talking to him live. So let's go through this point by point, because this is a lot. This really is a lot. And again, this is one of the headline, really promoted big speakers that was trying to bring people to the Rage Against the War Machine event. He was one of the big speakers. I mean, I wonder why there were so many Russian flags at the event. Anyway, let's listen. Let's go through it again, and let's break it down.
This is a war that was started and provoked by NATO and the West. Zelensky ran on peace, but he did.
Now, this is a point that I don't think helps them, but I hear it all the time. And it is true that Zelensky, when he won his election, when he became president of Ukraine 3-4 years ago, when he became president, he was running on a pro-peace platform while running against Petro Poroshenko. He then won and went into office, tried to make peace with the Russians, and failed. If somebody runs on a pro-peace platform against Petro Poroshenko and wins, tries his best and fails, does that necessarily mean that Zelensky's controlled and puppeted and evil and he went back on his word? Or could that indicate that there was no peace to be made? That the person that they were negotiating with had such radically crazy conditions that it would be impossible for Zelensky to accept them. And so he didn't accept the conditions, and therefore he knew that eventually this conflict could spark up again. So we gotta prepare. We gotta see what we can do to try to either dissuade an invasion by arming ourselves up, or get ready for the inevitable invasion that could happen. If we elected a very peaceful president in the United States and we went to war, I would think, in my mind, that would probably mean it was more likely a just war than a non-just war if we elected somebody who is really restrictive when it comes to the use of violence. I don't think this helps his point at all.
Didn't do it. So why? Because he got threatened by NATO and the ultra-right, the Nazis in Ukraine.
The reason why Zelensky did not cede to Russia's demands and negotiations was because the demands were ridiculous. And when we talk about the Minsk agreement, it was also due to Russia not fulfilling them. They did not withdraw as was talked about in the agreement. And if they didn't withdraw, how do you expect Zelensky to abide by their side of the agreement while Russian troops are still on Ukrainian territory?
And so they threaten to kill. He knows he's a dead man. If
also, this idea that they threatened to kill him or he would have been cooed by Ukrainian Nazis, the Azov Battalion, which is assume what he's talking about, or maybe he's talking about right sector, these groups do not have enough power to do that. They just don't. They don't have enough members. It's just not possible. But I will say, if Zelensky was to try to concede and surrender now and say, okay, you're going to get Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk, we're going to demilitarize, and we're not going to join any alliances, so if you invade again, nobody will come to our fence, and we'll also not have weapons to defend ourselves. He would probably be overthrown. I don't think it would be by Nazis. I think it would be by just generally the Ukrainian people, because they would see him as somebody who sold their country out and just made them easier to invade next time, which, if I'm going to be honest, is kind of reasonable considering the conditions Ukraine is under right now.
If he does a peace deal with Russia, so that's why he won't. Russia is the one that wants peace in this deal, and Ukraine and NATO do not.
Russia invaded the country. After saying that they wouldn't and that anybody saying they're going to invade is a crackpot, they then invaded. You do not invade a country and then claim to want peace. We didn't. When we invaded Iraq, it would have been really hypocritical for George Bush to say on day 3 of the invasion, we want peace. We want peace. I understand that. I mean, like, to me, the only justified want from war is a more sustainable and better peace, more prosperous peace. But that is not going to be achieved through the Russian invasion. Occupation is not going to achieve that. And their goals for it, when it came to overthrowing the government and annexing large swaths of territory, it was not for a sustainable peace. It was for the interest of the Russian state when it came to wanting military bases, wanting to control Ukraine, and only believing that Ukraine could only exist if it's subservient to Russian interests. Russia views Ukraine like a pawn, and it only can belong to them and only them. And if it's not serving Russian interests, then it has to be either brought into heel or destroyed.
They want to bleed Russia economically, and that's why they blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
We don't know who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline for sure. Even like people talk about the recent article that was released. The recent article, I think it's mostly built upon, when it comes to the hard claims that are made, a anonymous source. So that really depends upon how much you trust the journalist in question that gave the report. So I'm still looking for more.
Can't get why the European nations are going along with this. I mean,
it could have been the United States, but it's just like, I don't know, man. I've heard Jimmy Dore and others criticize news stations using anonymous sources before. It just seems very silly.
Foreign minister of Germany said, I don't care about my people if they don't want this. I care about the people of Ukraine. What leader of a country says they don't care about their own people, but they care more about somebody else's country?
The majority of Germans want to continue to send weapons to Ukraine. All polling data reflects this fact.
NATO has provoked this. In fact, there was a peace agreement in 2014. The CIA helped overthrow the Ukraine government.
There is no evidence for this. Jimmy Dore has been confronted about this before, and every time he's confronted about it, he runs away, doesn't answer questions, and just says, why would you make me debate this? This is a proven fact. He's basing this upon the Nuland phone call, even though in that phone call, American officials specifically say that they want the Ukrainian protesters to accept the Russian-aligned government demand, to accept the proposal from the Russian-aligned government on a compromise. The protesters did not do that. They kept protesting, which led to Yanukovych fleeing the country. So how is it that we organized the overthrow? We overthrew the government. We did all this stuff. We deposed the government. The CIA did it when there's no evidence of it, number one. And number two, the protesters went against the wishes of the United States.
And then the people in the Donbass didn't want to go along with this coup government, right? Because the leader of Ukraine...
I like how he says the people of the Donbass. Like, most of the people in the Donbass want this. We don't know for sure exactly what the majority of people believed when it comes specifically to Yanukovych, but Yanukovych had lost favorability with the vast majority of Ukrainians by the time he fled the country. That's part of the reason he fled the country. It's because he was getting so unpopular. His grip on the country was slipping, and he fled. He was not able to copy the style of Putin's regime in Russia, which he wanted to do in Ukraine. And so he had to flee because he had no other options yet, and he didn't want to continue do another round of negotiations because he didn't think it would work, and he saw that the clock was ticking. I don't know what else to say about it.
Ukraine wanted to be friendlier economically with Russia instead of...
Wait. Let's reel this back because this point's really bad.
Ukraine wanted to be friendlier economically with Russia instead of join like the European Union.
So this is just like completely a rewriting of history. Or actually, this is technically true, but it leaves out so much information that it becomes a lie. So when he says Ukraine wanted to become more economically tied with Russia instead of the European Union, and that's why the government was overthrown by the CIA. So what really happened is that in 2012, Yanukovych, the Russian-aligned Yanukovych, promised on the campaign trail that he would sign a deal with the European Union to allow visa-free travel along with a bunch of other economic relationships. This would be very helpful to the Ukrainian economy, and the majority of Ukrainians supported it. Then, 2 years later, as they're approaching the end goal for that deal and they're about to sign it, the Russian government stops trade with Ukraine. And that's like 20% of the trade. They just stop it on the border. It cannot advance. That is called economic coercion. They were doing this in order to try to force Ukraine into not accepting the deal with Europe by trying to cave out their economy, saying, if you do not become a part of our economic union instead of theirs, if you choose this more independent foreign policy from our interests, then you are not allowed Russian goods, and we will cave out your economy. You will have economic repercussions. Yanukovych then got scared. He caved to Putin and did a complete 180 on his promise. This angered the Ukrainian people. They went out of the street. This is known as the Euromaidan, also known as the Dignity Revolution. And when they went onto the street to protest, Yanukovych caving to this economic coercion, which Russia promised they wouldn't do in the 1991 Budapest Memorandum, by the way. I mean, economic coercion is specifically named in the Budapest Memorandum when Ukraine gave up its nukes. It said that Russia would not violate Ukraine's borders, and they would not economically coerce them. They did both. Every single thing they promised to do in that, they broke. And so at that point, protesters go out in the street. Yanukovych responds very violently with the Prokut and literally hired gangsters known as the Tutushki who went out and beat people. This pissed people off to see a bunch of student protesters mostly getting beaten with metal pipes, to see them brutalized that way. That made the protests expand into the Automaidan and a bunch of other factions. And eventually it led to Yanukovych fleeing the country after failing negotiations with those protesters. That is when Russia decided they were going to invade Crimea because they were scared about the lease on the Russian military base there not being renewed, as well as Russian nationalistic fervor of believing that Ukrainian clay belongs to us. We allow Ukraine to exist, but any day we could take that existence away. Very like imperial mindset, you know? Very like the Algerian, like we allowed the Algerian state to exist if the French was to say something ridiculous like that. Anyway, that is how all of this kicked off in 2014. That's how the invasion, the original invasion, 2014 invasion, kicked off. He leaves out all that data and boils all of that information down to, he removes the economic coercion, he removes the abusive protester, somebody who claims to care about police brutality, he removes all the details just to say CIA coup, which is a lie, and they removed him because he was friendly to Russia. Like, they remove all of the context of the lies that Yanukovych told, all the police brutality, the economic coercion. They remove all of that. Jimmy Dore, completely lacking of nuance.
And that they couldn't have that, right? So that's why they did a coup. And the people, the Russian speakers in the Donbass didn't want to go along with that coup.
By the way, there were many people in the Donbass who supported Yanukovych being out of power at that point in time, that he had gotten so brutal against the protesters that they didn't think it was respectable for him to stay in power. In fact, I interviewed a Euromaidan protester from Kharkiv on my channel, on my main channel, DylanBurnsLIVE. You can go check that out if you want.
They kind of wanted to break away.
By the way, they kind of wanted to break away. does not have proof for that. There's no polling data that says that the majority of people in the Donbass want to break away. And until very recently, they only controlled 1/3 of it, the rebels did, indicating that there was still a sizable portion of the Donbass that wanted to break away. And of the portion that was still controlled the Ukrainian government, we have very recent polling data showing the majority of them do not want to be part of Russia. And the polling data from before Yanukovych fled the country also seemed to reflect the fact that the majority of the people in the Donbass did not want to become part of Russia. There is no data reflecting that the majority of people in the Donbass want to be part of Russia. Just because you speak Russian does not mean you want to be part of Russia. Just because you speak English does not mean you want to be part of the United Kingdom in England. It's a pretty simple concept to grasp. I mean, there's a lot of countries in Africa that speak French. Does that mean they all want to be part of France? No, because it's a legacy from imperialism and colonialism. Same thing in Ukraine. It was due to the Russification of Ukraine, the banning of the Ukrainian language, the banning of Ukrainian literature, from pushing out Ukrainian literature out of the intelligentsia, that led to the Russification and the Russian language being so prominent, not only in the East, but in also other parts of the country.
Ukraine government started shelling the Donbass, and so they had a peace agreement called the Minsk Agreement.
He kind of leaves out the fact that there was like rebels and there was like a war there. He just said, it makes it sound like they just randomly started shelling the Donbass to kill people. There was fighting there. It was a war because the Russians were supplying rebels to fight and soldiers. It was a war. So yeah, shelling happens in war. I mean, he just makes it sound like they just randomly started shelling the Donbass. That Russia, that like they overthrew the government and then he just was like, we're going to kill all the Russians. He leaves out so much context here.
And that was supposed to give them independence. They were supposed to have their own elections and they were going to stop shelling them. They never did. They ended up killing like 14 or 15,000 people in the Donbass.
That's also not true. I've heard this number a million times and I've researched this number, and it comes from the total death count from the war in the Donbass for the last 8 years before the 2022 February 24th invasion. The 14 to 15,000 is the total death count in the war in the Donbass. That death count includes Ukrainian soldiers. So he is blaming Ukraine for the death of its own soldiers in shelling. What does that even, what? Doesn't even make sense. That means the soldiers that Russia killed, that these rebels killed, is included in the amount of people that Ukraine killed. I mean, it's a ridiculous number.
Merkel,
not to mention, he doesn't ever talk about like all the war crimes that the Sparta Battalion or any of the Russia side engaged in. It's always just Ukrainian shelling. Like the rebels didn't have artillery guns. By the way, where did the rebels get all this heavy equipment? Where did the rebels get these tanks? Where did the rebels get all this stuff? Did he just magically have all these stockpiles in the specific parts of the country where the rebellion happened, which just so happened to be on the Russian border on an interconnected highway system? Come on, get out of here.
Former Prime Minister of Germany just admitted that the only reason they did that peace agreement was to give Ukraine enough time to build up its military, so when they finally did provoke an invasion, which is what they did, that they would have a military ready to fight Russia.
It's literally just like bad statement after bad statement. I do not know what exactly was the real motives behind the Minsk agreements. Angela Merkel, now that her legacy has been very much tarnished by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because she was very much more of the more conciliatory path, very much of the like, hey, economic development with Russia will eventually make them liberalize, and you know it keeps peace and prosperity, right? Kind of disregarded like the immediate ideological stance of Russia, the authoritarian, kind of ignored that, saying that the trade will bring peace. Now that that legacy has largely been smashed, and Germany has taken this new direction under Olaf Scholz, and pressure from the international community and pressure from Germans who want them to support Ukraine. Now Angela Merkel is giving interviews where she's saying all of a sudden that the Minsk Accords and the Minsk Agreement was actually just a stalling tactic. So she's saying now after the fact that it was all 4D, chess. Maybe that's true, but I don't know why. Actually, no, that's a lie. Why is Jimmy just immediately believing Angela Merkel? Why is it that now, later on, that it comes and she's trying to dust up her legacy more, that he just believes her at her word when she says that, or when other people say that? Why? These are people that I would assume like that Jimmy doesn't trust very much. I mean, it might be true, but why does he just trust that new narrative that just so happens to also make them look a lot better, right? I don't know. They might not have. But this is the thing that gets me. If that is true, They were right. They were right to continue to prepare. They were right to continue to get weapons because Russia was not satisfied. And so they launched a larger invasion later. So they were right. They were right if that is the correct thing. If that is what they did, they were right. It was the correct thing to do because they knew that later that they would invade more. And if that is the truth, then they were right. He says that they provoked them into an invasion. But the Russians had to make false flag attacks and film them in order to justify their invasion, much like the Germans did when they had German soldiers dress up in Polish uniforms and attack German positions. They did that here in this war as well in order to justify the invasion. If there's so much evidence of Russia provoking Ukraine, why did they have to create false flag attacks in order to do this? And I would think Jimmy Dore, being somebody who's more on the conspiratorial end, would be really excited to talk about a false flag attack. Right, an actual false flag attack that is verifiably a false flag attack, and you can go check this out if you want. What I'm talking about is that a few days before the war, the Russian government released footage claiming to show a Ukrainian invasion of Russia. It had people in Ukrainian uniforms marching into what they declared as internationally recognized Russian territory. When the footage was geolocated, due to, just the open, they posted it publicly, so all the open source intel guys started decoding it. They were able to geolocate it, and where did they geolocate it to? Deep into Ukrainian occupied territory in the Donbass. How did the Ukrainians invade Russia from territory that was occupied? Did they sneak like 100 miles behind enemy lines to launch it? No. They dressed up Russian soldiers in Ukrainian uniforms, much like the Germans did to the Poles, and made it look like they attacked them in order to justify an invasion. They also made claims about biological chemical weapons that targets Russian DNA and these weapons facilities. Like, none of that was ever substantiated. They said so much bullshit that was never substantiated. So if it is true that Ukraine provoked them, why did Russia have to lie so much in order to justify the invasion? And we already know that the Russians have lied in relation to the invasion because they said they weren't going to invade in the first place, but then they did.
And so people don't know this is what happened. And so they just think that one day Putin woke up and said, I want to go invade Ukraine because I'm a maniac. And they think that
I don't think that's how most people think of it, or most analysts even think of it. I hear people say this all the time, like people just call Putin a maniac. Not necessarily. I think actually a majority of analysts don't think he's a maniac, that he made a misjudgment when it came to invading Ukraine, when it came to like how easy it would be, and that he's like a hardcore Russian nationalist and wants to rebuild the Russian Empire. That's his logic. And under that logic, you could justify an invasion of Ukraine, right? I don't think most people actually call him a maniac. I think this is really a straw man for most of the people who oppose the Russian invasion and people who want to support Ukraine. There are some people who think he's a maniac, but I don't think the majority of people think he's a maniac in the actual always crazy terms, but more like he's like a warmongering, authoritarian, horrible person, I think is usually what people mean.
he's the bad guy. They think that he's acting rationally. We always knew he would do this. In fact, we did not know he was always going to invade Ukraine. We knew due to intelligence like months before it happens, and that's why we shared it with the world and put a lot of egg on Russia's faces as they still continued to deny it, as they prepared and got like blood ready to give the soldiers so they get shot, and they put it on the border. Like, it was very obvious what they were preparing to do in the way of like what they were preparing potentially to do. Whether they were going to pull the trigger on it, we didn't know. We did not know for years that they were going to do this. We thought they possibly could. Part of the reason why we sent them weapons for years, even if it was not enough. But we didn't know for sure they were going to. I don't know why he believes that. I think it's just that one Angela Merkel interview, and that's not enough to base that claim off of. We're counting on him doing this. That's why we did what we did. And they don't know that Ukraine...
By the way, if we always knew they were going to do this, why didn't we send them a lot more weapons? Because like now we're sending them all the weapons. Now we're training Ukrainians on Abrams tanks, right? But why didn't we do that for the last 8 years? Why did we wait till now to really step up weapon shipments, where if we did this for the last 8 years, when Russia would have invaded, they would have already had the Abrams. They would have already had these great systems. They would have already been trained on them. And maybe not the Abrams, maybe it could have been less than that, but they could have had this equipment in advance.
ramped up their bombing right before the war started last year. They doubled their bombing. They were really trying to provoke it, and they did. And they provoked it. And the Russian would rather have a peace agreement.
By the way, the Ukrainians did not want Russia to invade. This is ridiculous. This is silly. This is just nonsensical. I'm just sorry. I don't know what else to say about that.
The rest of the world would rather have a peace agreement. Not NATO, not Joe Biden, not the military-industrial complex. And so that's where we are.
Okay, that's enough of that. Everybody wants there to be peace, but on whose terms is the question, and that is the thing that Jimmy Dore always seems to ignore when we talk about a peace agreement. Because the thing about a peace agreement is that it's an agreement. That means you take your terms and you find terms that are acceptable to both parties. Maybe not something you want, but are at least tolerable, right? The terms that Russia is asking for, the annexation of Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhia, as well as the demilitarization of Ukraine, meaning Ukraine has no means to defend itself, as well as Ukraine committing not to join any alliance structure, meaning not only does it not have weapons to defend itself, but it does not have allies to defend itself next time an invasion happens. That is an intolerable demand. Those demands are intolerable, and that's why, unless Russia can realign their position to be more acceptable, which I don't think they can, at least not for Ukrainians, 89% of them wanting all their territory back, it's just they can't come to terms. All that Russia has to do to end a war is leave. If they're really for peace, all they have to do is leave Ukraine. That's all they have to do. That's it. That's it. That is it. Do you really think that if Vladimir Putin said, we will leave all of Ukraine, but just don't join NATO specifically, or don't put nukes in Ukraine, or some demand like that, that Zelensky would say, no, get out of here? It's that he wants more than that. I am TKL. Thank you so much for the tier 1. Hey, glad to support Slava Ukraini. I appreciate it. Appreciate it, buddy. My goodness, man. Jimmy Dore, man, he has descended and gotten worse and worse and worse. I think he kind of has to do this since nobody really wants to book him much for comedy anymore. And so he's leaning into this more, and he certainly found his niche. But God darn it, man. The lack of nuance and the cherry picking here is like, doesn't even border on dishonesty. It is dishonesty. It's really bad. Can we just give Russia an NFT of Ukraine? That's what yes.